When recalling the average Western film, an immediate image that comes to mind is the heroic cowboy. Countless bandits frequenting town saloons, or bars, to put it simply. Continuous shootouts in town squares with crowds of spectators, constant clashes with Native Americans, and an inherent skill in handling revolvers with precision. Let's clarify an important point right away. Americans, the cultural bearers of the Wild West, rarely ever produced Western films. Primarily, it was the Italians, and to some extent the French, who engaged in this. Therefore, the depictions of characters in these films are highly distorted by definition. Furthermore, if someone decided to make a movie about the real lives of cowboys and others, it would be unwatchable, simply because it would be boring. Let's debunk a few myths and provide a compilation of facts about the Wild West. Cowboys were not heroes. Moreover, they weren't divine marksmen or even remotely literate. In reality, they were simple herdsmen, illiterate, somewhat timid, whose job was to graze cattle. Importantly, they grazed other people's cattle, they didn't own any. In fact, most of them didn't even own horses, they used what belonged to their employers. The essence of their lives wasn't about climbing the social ladder or fighting enemies, which they generally tried to avoid at all costs, but rather about leading a quiet existence and attempting to earn a modest living. And yes, almost all of them were impoverished. Bandits rarely ever frequented saloons. In fact, they tried to keep a low profile even in towns. While there were indeed many of them in the Wild West, these local knife and axe wielders predominantly resided in the countryside or even in untouched nature. The reason is straightforward. During those times, urban police throughout the Wild West genuinely upheld the law. If necessary, any sheriff would simply shoot a bandit on the street without any formal trial. In short, the less attention, the better for the American criminal underworld. Cowboys did not fight with Native Americans. At least, they tried to avoid confrontations. Moreover, they often collaborated with them, offering assistance, trading with the natives, and so on. The essence of it was simple: Native Americans primarily lived in the prairies, and it was the military, professional bounty hunters, major criminal gangs, etc., who pursued them. Cowboys, on the other hand, grazed cattle in these very prairies, which means they were surrounded by aggrieved indigenous people. Now, imagine if the herdsmen got into conflicts with these Native Americans, they'd likely be left in pieces. Additionally, cooperating with the native populations was simply beneficial for the cowboys, and they never turned down a profitable opportunity. It wasn't the Native Americans who started scalping. In the mid-19th century, the indigenous people were almost officially labeled as enemies by the authorities. Calls for their extermination echoed, leading to bloodshed. At the state level, a bounty was declared for every killed Native American, $25, a significant sum for the time. This led to the emergence of professional bounty hunters who massacred the indigenous Americans in droves. As proof of their deeds, they began collecting their heads. However, this proved inconvenient. Hence, they devised the practice of scalping, presenting the scalps to sheriffs to claim their rewards. Witnessing this brutality, the Native Americans retaliated in kind and, it must be said, learned to scalp the white men with surgical precision. There were Russians in the Wild West. The Russian Empire was a relatively prosperous nation, but not for all its inhabitants. For instance, many urban workers lived in conditions that, if not entirely dire, were far from ideal. As a result, they ventured to distant lands on meager savings, hoping to realize their ambitions and earn more money. However, only a few achieved success. The traces of the vast majority of Russians who migrated to America during that period are lost. In the Wild West, the tradition of keeping weapons at home emerged. Both then and now, this was done for self-protection. The only difference is that in the 19th century, the likelihood of encountering a hardened bandit, a cattle header on a spree, or an aggressive animal was much higher than it is today. Contrary to Western movies, ordinary people rarely had rifles, they relied on revolvers. And, by the way, they weren't particularly skilled with them. The reason is simple: revolvers were relatively cheap. The Wild West had very strict laws. They arose from the authorities' desire to deal with the brazen bandits of the time and were a justified measure. For instance, one could be hanged for stealing a horse, and minor thefts led to the same fate. Even for a stolen hat, this is not a myth, hats were highly valued in the Wild West, one could end up with a noose around their neck. It should be noted that these measures had their effect. While there was crime, it didn't run entirely rampant.